I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, why is the UK handling the refugee crisis so badly? And what could we do better?
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Each afternoon, I'm joined by leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting across Europe to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's day 14. And today, I'm with the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor, Dominic Nicholls, and our Assistant Foreign Editor, Venetia Rainey. Dom, let's start with an update from the front lines. How are things looking on the ground in Ukraine?
Very quiet yesterday in terms of movement. A lot of shelling still continuing around the north and the northeast and in the southern corridor around Mariupol, but not a lot of advancing on the ground. The big news was these Polish MiG-29s, 28 of them that Poland has suggested could be sent to Ukraine in a sort of ramping up of the lethal aid that we've seen so far. Got into a bit of a mess yesterday with Poland saying that they would send these planes to the US air base at Ramstein in Germany and they quoted, the Polish said that they were not part of the war. Put the US in a bit of a difficult position. They said they weren't going to fly them forward or do anything with them, and they should not be sent there. So in a bit of an impasse at the moment. And it's led to a couple of thoughts. Firstly, why MiG-29s? I mean, capable aircraft, but quite old, and 28 is good. But as we've seen with the enormous amount of equipment that Russia has deployed into Ukraine, numbers don't mean everything, if they mean anything at all. I mean, you've got to ally them with the systems and the people and the processes and everything to make it work. So it's very odd that this issue's come out of nowhere. And if the Western allies were looking to supply more lethal equipment above and beyond the anti-tank missiles and anti-air missiles, then why not air defence? There's a number of former Soviet countries who could supply air defence equipment, and that again would take the sting out of it slightly. They could be they'd be described as defensive lethal aid weapons, if you can have such a description. But what it's done is it's bring the threshold of what lethal aid is and what it isn't into sharp focus, because after all, it's talking about killing people at the end of the day. So does it matter what the means of that delivery is? But by having this spat developed between Poland and the US and sort of discussion more broadly in NATO, it sort of almost gives a vote to President Putin to say where that line is between what is acceptable and not acceptable lethal aid. I just wonder if there's a role here for Finland, Sweden. Perhaps they are not part of NATO. They've been very, very keen to stay out of NATO, but they are embedded in the Western security architecture. And I wonder if possibly these aircraft routing to Ukraine via a neutral country, in this context of Finland or Sweden, might actually be quite helpful. But that's just some thoughts. I don't know why this political issue has been played out in the public eye. It's been quite surprising.
And there was news today on the Chernobyl nuclear plant north of Kyiv. Venetia, do you want to talk us through what's happening there?
Yeah, so this is quite a worrying development. Obviously, last week we saw the attack on Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station down in the south of Ukraine. That's still under Russian control. There's apparently 400 troops there. Chernobyl was seized a few weeks before that, right at the beginning of the conflict. And what we've heard now is that it's gone offline. So essentially, the electricity lines to the power plant have been damaged. No one can get to them to repair them because of the fighting. And that's going to have a few effects. One of them is that the people inside the plant, and there are still about 200 Ukrainian workers trapped there. Apparently they've been working for 13 days straight, which is a concern in and of itself. But these people won't be able to monitor any spike in radiation if there's no power. So that's a worry. There was a spike, for example, back in May 2021. And, once you see that spike, you can do things to prevent it. You can evacuate people if you think it's an issue. But if there's no power, then the people in the plant have no idea what's actually happening. The second big thing that the lack of power will affect is the air conditioning system. So inside this 2 billion confinement unit that was set up after the 1986 disaster, which led to hundreds of people being killed and radiation over a very large part of Europe, this confinement unit was built as sort of a bunker over the whole thing to prevent any further radiation leaking out. Now, it gets very warm in there because there's still nuclear material that is giving off radiation. So an air conditioning unit was installed to prevent any condensation forming. And what was happening before this air conditioning unit was there was that it was almost raining inside, and the condensation, the water, was reacting with the nuclear materials and setting off some sort of chain reaction. So to avoid that, the air conditioning unit was installed. Obviously, if there's no power, that won't be working. There's also a separate issue where some fuel rods that are spent have been taken outside of the reactor and put in their own sort of separate buildings as part of the decommissioning process. They are kept cool by a water cooling system, but there's only 48 hours basically until that water cooling system will stop. There's about 2 days worth of diesel to keep that going. So you've got these two separate issues, and we're not saying anything catastrophic is happening immediately, but it is an issue. And if they can't monitor what's going on, if they can't stop condensation from forming, if they can't keep these spent fuel rods cool, then in a matter of weeks, we could start to see radioactivity leaking out of this plant. That's the situation at the moment. Ukraine has called for a ceasefire so that they can urgently repair the power lines. This is obviously an issue of regional, global interest. So they are working to try and find a way to work with the Russians to stop that from happening.
Thank you very much, Venetia. Another thing just to pick up on, I think, there was news in the Telegraph today about the British soldiers who've apparently gone to Ukraine. Dom, as a former soldier, what's your take on this?
Well, I have to say I'm kind of in line with what James Heappey, the Minister for Armed Forces, said last week. He said that if you want to stand up for democracy and you're prepared to put a uniform on and fight and what have you, then you should. If you're in this country anyway, you should join the British Army. It's we discussed it briefly last week. It's very difficult to see how these people, and we haven't really bottomed out if it's actually how many have gone and quite where, and whether or not they are serving soldiers or veterans or what have you. But if they've gone, there's a great moral case to do that. But as I've said before, I wonder if putting on a uniform, firing a weapon you've probably never picked up before, reacting to orders in a language that you might not understand or have ever heard before, how much military utility are you actually bringing to the battlefield, and are you being a help or a hindrance? If people feel that strongly that they want to put themselves in harm's way, and it's a very laudable aim, I'm not knocking that at all. But as I've said before, I question whether or not it's better to help elsewhere, to help some of the humanitarian aid efforts. I've been trying to speak to some of these people to say, do you want to go there and fight for you or for Ukraine? Because if you're prepared to do anything to help the cause, then you might be best placed at a casualty exchange point or some form of admin or logistics place. That might be where you are best suited, your skills, your language skills and what have you. So it's an interesting story, but I wonder quite how much utility this foreign legion will actually bring to the battlefield.
And Venetia, I know you wanted to speak a bit about this interesting story that's come out of a Ukrainian colonel who sent a message to his cousin who is a Russian politician. Do you want to speak a bit about that?
Yeah, I think this is just sort of one of the many human stories that we're seeing. We've heard a lot about how Ukrainians and Russians are very close. Lots of people have relatives there or very close friends. They'd work there, they'd travel there, they'd take their holidays there. These were not two countries that were previously particularly at war in terms of the two people. Obviously, there's been an issue in the East for a long time now. But so we saw a video posted by a Ukrainian, quite a senior Ukrainian officer down in Odessa, which is a Black Sea port city in the south of Ukraine. And he put up this very heartfelt video, essentially pleading with his cousin, who's a Russian lawmaker in the Duma on the Defense Committee, pleading with him to stop the war, saying our parents would be turning in their graves if they could see what was happening now. Don't you remember how we used to play together in these areas, and aren't you ashamed of what's happening? It was a really emotional message, and I think it really shows that these long-held ties between people in different countries are really being frayed here, and there's a very human level to this conflict on top of the sort of the tanks rolling and the military columns and everything. And I think it's important to keep sight of that as well. I thought that this video was a really good example of that.
And there's another human element potentially to pick up on as well, Venetia, is the impact that Russian mothers and soldiers' mothers in Russia have on the country. We've published a few things on that in the Telegraph over the past few days. Dom and Venetia, what are the impacts? What is the impact of Russian mothers?
Yeah, so we've done a great story today about the Soldiers' Mothers Committee and the sort of role that Russian mothers are playing in all of this. We've spoken a lot about how some Russian soldiers don't seem to have been aware of what they were doing when they invaded. Maybe they thought they were on training exercises. Maybe they didn't know exactly where they were, but it doesn't seem that they were as prepared as we might have expected. And certainly their family members don't seem to have known what was happening. So the Soldiers' Mothers Committee in Russia is an advocate for veterans, and they've been calling on Putin to provide more transparency. And Putin actually addressed mothers directly yesterday, saying, we will take care of your husbands and the men in your families. We also saw the Ukrainian government to set up a hotline called Come Back from Ukraine Alive. Their plan is to try and get the truth out and to help Russians to find their relatives who are in Ukraine. We've seen a lot of videos and images of Russian soldiers who have given themselves up or been captured and trying to call home, often in tears. There's also a Telegram app that's been set up in Ukraine, Look for Your People, where Russian mothers can look for their sons, Russian wives can look for their husbands. And this is all about this sort of desperate women trying to get in touch with the men in their lives who they haven't heard from for months, trying to find information about where they are, calling them lost, and very tearful messages that we're hearing. I think it's just a really powerful aspect of all of this and shows that a lot of people have been caught by surprise by it and are not necessarily willing participants in this war, perhaps.
Dom, I don't know if you want to come in on that at all.
Not so much on that, but just another couple of quick points, if I may. So last night, the CIA director, Bill Burns, who was US ambassador to Russia 2005 to 2008, he was speaking in front of the House Intelligence Committee in Washington and gave confirmation, if any were needed, that the plan has gone completely awry for Russia. He said Putin planned to seize Kiev in the first couple of days, and the plan was based on 4 false assumptions. Firstly, that Ukraine was weak militarily and politically. Secondly, that Europe was going to be distracted and would offer no particular response. Thirdly, that the Russian economy was strong enough to withstand any sanctions that would come back. And finally, the Russian military had modernized and would fight effectively. And he says that all 4 of those assumptions have been found wanting. And he gave this quote. He said it's going to be ugly for the next few weeks, which I think we've all been warning about. And just one other final point, if I may. We've been tracking the issue of possible false flag attacks or reports from Russia about any Ukrainian nuclear activity, dirty bomb or nuclear program as a way of justifying their invasion. Well, I have to admit, I got that wrong. They didn't say nuclear, but yesterday the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokeswoman Maria Zakharova, she came out and said that they've found component parts of a US-sponsored biological weapons program being run. It's the first thing we've heard of it, of course. This wasn't mentioned in the run-up to the war. This wasn't given as part of the reason for the invasion. This wasn't one of Putin's demands before the war. But no, apparently the Russians have found elements of a program including plague, anthrax, cholera and rabbit fever that the Ukrainians were developing with US assistance. So there we go. As expected, these developments, these discoveries are coming out now as a way of sort of retrospectively justifying the invasion a couple of weeks ago.
And Venetia, I believe you had one more thing to add about Chechens in Ukraine.
Yeah, so obviously there's been ongoing focus on this convoy that's trying to reach Kiev and questions about why the Russians haven't managed to reach Kiev quickly enough. There's been lots of fighting. What we've heard today is that more Chechens are now being deployed because Russia is essentially struggling to assemble a large enough force to take Kiev. We've seen reports that 100% of the forces that Russia had been amassing around Ukraine in the last few months have now been deployed. So clearly they're having to turn elsewhere. And apparently thousands more Chechens and other sort of Kremlin-allied mercenaries have been sent to the front line north of Kiev ahead of what we expect to be a renewed push to capture the city in the coming days.
And finally, I'd just like to ask you both, we hear that further talks between the two sides are continuing. Should we take much hope from this? Has there been any shift in positions from either the Russians or the Ukrainians?
No shift in position, but I just reiterate what I said the other day, that talking is always better than not. I'll say again that all wars end, and most wars end by negotiation. So the sooner you can start those negotiations, the longer you can keep them going for, the more you can talk, as long as you're not being used. And obviously that's a very delicate line. But the more you're talking, the more the chances are of it actually leading somewhere and bringing this thing to a resolution.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and that's the position that the Ukrainians and Zelensky have taken, that it's better to be talking than not, and we're all hoping for some kind of resolution. We don't know what form that will take. We don't know how seriously the Russians are taking this, but I do think it's good to hope, good to keep hoping for now.
During this conflict, the refugee crisis isn't looming; it's already started, and for the UK, it's not going well. Britain's Home Office is under fire, accused of a lack of compassion over a chaotic and slow visa application process for those fleeing the conflict. Boris Johnson, for his part, says the UK is opening its arms to those seeking refuge. But what's happening behind the scenes, and why is it so difficult for Ukrainian refugees to enter the UK? To find out, I spoke to Olivia Utley and Mutaz Ahmed from our comment team, and Tony Diver, our Whitehall correspondent. Tony started by filling us in on what's really going on at the UK borders.
Well, I mean, the government's under a lot of pressure to try and facilitate these Ukrainians travelling across to the UK. As you say, there have been about 2 million who've left Ukraine already, and a lot of those people are trying to find somewhere safe to go to in the West. We know that so far there's been about 17,000 people who have applied for a UK visa to travel over to the UK, and the government's opened up a scheme which it says will help people travel here and sort of help women and children who are fleeing the war zone. The difficulty is that there have been some pretty serious administrative issues in sorting out this system, and that what's happened basically is that only about 300 visas have actually been granted so far. And a lot of people are stuck at visa processing centres, either in Ukraine or in Poland. So we've got our reporter, Henry Bodkin, is out there in Poland at the moment. He filed a dispatch this morning where he'd spoken to a British person who was over there helping a relative. And that person said that they'd been instructed by the Home Office to go to a visa processing centre back in Lviv in Ukraine, despite the fact that they'd already made their way into Poland, despite the fact that Lviv is actually currently 50 miles inside the war zone. So the Home Office is advising people to go to centres that don't exist. They've been telling people that they can turn up without an appointment, when in fact it turns out you do need an appointment, and there is a fairly complicated sort of process that people have to go through, which could take 2 weeks, and these people are sort of generally sleeping, but essentially sleeping rough and sleeping out in the freezing cold because they don't have anywhere to go because their homes have been consumed by war. So it's not a great look for the Home Office at the moment, it must be said. The government's come out and sort of, there's been a lot of warm words towards people leaving Ukraine who Boris Johnson says the UK is opening its arms to, whereas in reality, once again, Britain demonstrates that its capabilities in organising last-minute evacuations that we saw in Afghanistan has not much improved since then, and actually, administratively, it's been a bit of a nightmare so far.
Thank you, Tony. Olivia or Mutaz, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, there are quite a lot of sort of different theories about what is going wrong. If you listen to Priti Patel, she's saying that the reason that there's such a blockage is because the Home Office doesn't want to let in Ukrainians without checks because it'll encourage a build-up of people at Calais, some of whom will be people who've got in via people smugglers, and she thinks that it's going to encourage another flow of small boats coming. That's what she's briefing some journalists. But then you've got Ian Blackford saying that Priti Patel, this is just part of Priti Patel's hostile environment for refugees, and there are some MPs who are saying that Priti Patel has just misread the mood here. She thinks that she's got to follow some sort of anti-immigration line to follow through on what she promised in the manifesto, and she doesn't understand that actually the country feels very, very differently about Ukrainian refugees than it does about other economic migrants coming in. So there are all those arguments going on, and then there's what Tony was talking about, which I think is the most compelling argument, that it's much more cock-up than conspiracy. As has been said many times, the Home Office just doesn't seem to be fit for purpose, and it just isn't prepared organisationally and logistically to be letting in these new refugees. And you hear these stories of families who are trying to bring over a woman who's trying to bring over her sister. She lives in Aberdeen, and her sister and her family are being asked to provide photocopies and biometric tests and all sorts of different forms of identification, which obviously no one fleeing from a war zone could possibly have on them. So it does seem to be more cock-up than conspiracy, but then you've got all of these other competing theories about why it's such a mess, and that doesn't really play very well for the Home Office either. There's no clarity about what's going wrong, which is quite frustrating for anyone who's desperately trying to flee their country, and also for all sorts of politicians who are finding their constituents getting very angry with them because the situation is just such a mess.
Mutaz.
Yeah, I'd agree with Tony and Liv. I don't think there's a problem with political will, right? So maybe Priti Patel's freelancing, but the message from the Prime Minister is pretty clear, which is that this country wants to be as open as possible to Ukrainian refugees. It's not really a problem with political will. The political will was there. We saw the House of Commons yesterday when Zelensky spoke united in support of Ukraine. I think the British public is pretty open to accepting Ukrainian refugees. These are going to be people who want to return to their homeland once the Russians are defeated. The problem is with the Home Office. It's definitely with the Home Office. Anyone who's covered sort of home affairs, will know this. The department has been sort of shaped over the last 10 years, through the Cameron era, through the Theresa May era, up to now, shaped to say no to people applying. whether that's the ambassador's wife or academics in Africa or in Asia, people who are highly qualified. The department's sort of designed to say no to them. And so when you ask this department that has gotten so used to saying no to start saying yes to thousands of people, it's obviously going to have a problem. The second issue is that it's just vast. It's a massive, massive department, lots of bureaucracy, and it has this sort of papers, please culture. And we saw this with Windrush, right? The system couldn't understand the difference between a Windrush Brit and an illegal immigrant. And that's because the system is designed to be entirely based on sort of papers and applications and face-to-face contact, or even Skype calls and interviews have become more limited in recent years. So that's a problem, right? There are some stories of, people are unable to apply because they don't have a stable internet connection in Ukraine. Well, of course they don't have a stable internet connection in Ukraine. And as soon as they cut off, apparently they have to start the process again. Well, that doesn't make sense. And the third problem is the Home Office is actually quite unique compared to other countries in that it combines immigration handling with internal security. So you've got the Department for Domestic Security together with what should probably be a separate department for processing visas and processing people. When they're together, you're going to end up with unnecessary blockages. And some of the security concerns I think we're hearing are born out of that. So there are basically two ways you can fix this. Either you say any Ukrainian who comes to this country can just come in, or you bring in another department. And it was interesting in PMQ's, Boris Johnson suggested perhaps the Department for Levelling Up could play a role. That might be a way of circumventing these very long-term issues in the Home Office.
Olivia, Tony, Anne says you work in politics, speak to a lot of politicians. What's the reaction to this been in the Conservative Party? What are you hearing from backbenchers?
Well, I think there is what Mita said was right. There is a feeling among MPs across the House that Britain needs to be doing as much as it possibly can to help these people. And I think having Zelensky speak this week, yesterday, probably solidified that. But also remember last week we talked about the Ukrainian ambassador coming and visiting Prime Minister's questions and receiving a standing ovation from the House of Commons. I think there is a feeling on all sides that the government needs to be doing everything that it can. I thought there was an interesting exchange today, actually, in PMQs between Ian Blackford and the Prime Minister, where he said that the country thought that Britain wasn't doing enough. And the Prime Minister replied that he thought that Ian Blackford had misjudged public opinion, and actually the country thought that people in the general public think that Britain is doing enough. And there is a sort of question about what it means to be doing enough. Clearly, there are various different sorts of policy levers that the government can pull in this situation. It can send humanitarian aid, which we've done. We can send military aid. We can send arms, which we've done. And then there is just this question of how many people you can take on. So, how quite exactly from a purely political point of view, the public will pass those various different policies and come to their own conclusion about whether or not the government is doing enough. It's quite a difficult question to answer. I think certainly at this point, it feels like everyone is sort of pushing for ministers to do more than they currently are. I think the other interesting point is that we have slightly the same debate about refugees coming from Ukraine to the UK as we did during the Syrian conflict and people coming from Afghanistan, which is to say, why exactly are people coming to the UK rather than going elsewhere in Europe? Because it's a lot further to go. Is a main point to point out. It would be a lot easier to get to Germany than it would be to get to the UK from Ukraine. And that point was actually made in a tweet this afternoon by the Ukrainian embassy to the UK, who said, well, really, the UK is probably not going to be a main destination for people who are fleeing, because people are, pretty likely to want to stop in the first place that's safe. So if you do have women and children who are desperately telling you, please let us come to Britain, then you probably should, because these people probably don't have any other choice. No one particularly wants to schlep all the way through Belgium and France and to get all the way over and then go through the Calais jungle to get back to the UK. And I think that point is quite compelling, and I think that probably will cut through quite seriously with politicians here who are not understating the desperation of the situation that these people are in.
Several of you have mentioned this phrase as a cock-up, not a conspiracy. So I guess my question is, who's ultimately responsible for this? And do we think there will be any consequences, or do you think if they change tack quickly enough, they'll survive? Olivia?
Well, I think we've got to say that Priti Patel probably is ultimately responsible for this. And it does seem like there's quite a lot of cabinet frustration with her. We've seen Ben Wallace sort of try to defer issues over to Priti Patel. Liz Truss said on the radio yesterday that when asked about the refugees issue, she said, well, that's Priti Patel's concern, not mine. And it doesn't seem like Priti Patel is communicating particularly well with the rest of the cabinet. You've got Grant Shapps sort of saying that actually he's defending what the government's position on refugees is, saying that actually not many refugees would want to come to the UK, and it's much better for them. Ukraine would like them to stay in neighbouring countries because then they can return more easily, which might be true, but that doesn't seem to be official government policy. That's not actually what Priti Patel's saying. She's sort of freelancing, as we were saying earlier, and suggesting that her reason for it is that she doesn't want a whole new influx of small boats, which also probably isn't true. The problem is probably that the Home Office is just a bit of a mess and can't cope with this influx. I think it now seems quite likely that Priti Patel doesn't survive the next reshuffle. She's been loyal to Boris Johnson. She's a firm Brexiteer. She's taken a very strong line on immigration, and she's got this new immigration system going, which Boris Johnson quite likes. But she really has fallen short on this occasion, and also during the COVID times, she was a bit of a liability on the airwaves, and we saw that she was taken off. So I think Priti Patel is probably on her last legs, but if anyone disagrees, do feel free to tell me.
Well, it's always seen as the department that you don't really want, isn't it, in a reshuffle? No one wants to be the Home Secretary. It's one of the great offices of state, so it comes with it a certain element of status. But it is one of the most difficult things to do, is be Home Secretary, because of what you were saying earlier, Mutaz, about the huge range of issues that you have to cover. And, from a terror attack that goes wrong, ending in people's deaths, issues in the police, and then the whole issue of immigration, national security. I mean, it is an astonishingly broad department. And so I think people are generally willing to cut Home Secretaries a bit of slack on the basis that there will eventually be a political crisis that ends their career. I'm not totally convinced that this is the one for Priti Patel. I mean, wouldn't say necessarily that the migration or refugee issue is the defining political issue of this crisis so far. I mean, there are people like Ben Wallace, Liz Truss, the PM, who are coming out of this quite well and, showing the UK as a generous nation that's doing its best. So I'm not sure it necessarily has the ability to become an all-consuming story for Priti Patel. But, then again, these things are difficult to predict. We'll probably be sat here next week talking about how she's gone. So it's a fool's game making those sort of predictions.
Yeah, lots of people in the Tory party are frustrated because, as you said, Tony, Britain is doing lots in other areas. I think Ben Wallace announced just now that we've sent 3,500 anti-tank weapons to Ukraine, and we're about to send more. You're seeing these videos on social media of Ukrainian fighters sort of displaying their British in-laws and thanking Her Majesty the Queen for giving them their weapons. And we were doing this while Germany and France were sort of quite nervous about sending weapons. I don't think they were sending these kinds of weapons at all. We avoided German airspace to save us the trouble of asking them early on during the crisis in transporting weapons. So all this good stuff, and it's being undermined by this troublesome sort of troubled department that every month it has a crisis because its systems have for about 2 decades not worked properly. So who's responsible? Probably like 30 years of Home Office policy. Yeah, that's the response. It's frustration. No one should think this is where the British government wants to be when it comes to refugees. The British government wants to do a lot more. It's just stuck in this muddle and this mess of bureaucracy.
So I'd be curious, Mutaz, you touched on this earlier, but how do we get out of this and how would that happen? Are we looking for Boris Johnson to put pressure on Priti Patel to make the process simpler? What are the obvious things that we can see coming down the track, or is there anything? Is this a row that's going to continue over the next few days?
It will continue, but the easiest way out of it is to circumvent the Home Office. You're not going to fix the Home Office overnight. It consumes every scheme. So you're not going to fix it overnight. The easiest way is to bring in someone from the outside, I don't know, someone like Michael Gove, and task them with dealing with Ukrainian refugees and setting up a sort of separate system that makes it easier for them to apply. That's the quickest way to deal with it. And it shouldn't take too long because, as Tony was saying, we're not going to end up with the same number of Ukrainian refugees as Poland. And we shouldn't, because a lot of these refugees want to go home when this war is over. And part of the focus has to be on sort of providing humanitarian aid and financial assistance to countries bordering Ukraine. But yeah, there will be an announcement, I think, Boris Johnson said today, in the coming days. It will probably be a way to sort of work around the Home Office system rather than fix it.
Tony?
I think one of the other things to say is that previously, when we've had issues with refugees, when we've been looking at evacuations, and I'm thinking now of the Afghanistan crisis, which was not that long ago, the way that we solved that, to the little extent that we did, was by sending over British troops who were able to stand in the airport in Afghanistan, in Kabul, and help process this paperwork, help railroad things through back in London, put pressure on Whitehall. The Defence Secretary did a good job over in that crisis. There is a slightly different political context here, which is that what we're talking about is right on the border between NATO and Russia. And so, if Britain needs to send a load of troops to try and help this refugee issue, that's probably not going to do much for the tensions between the West and Putin. So that is another consideration here, is that actually the levers that are available to pull are slightly constrained by a more complicated geopolitical situation, and using the MOD in the way that we have done previously is not necessarily an option.
Olivia Utley, do you want to come in on any of that or add to anything?
Yeah, I think that, one thing that the government has done yesterday is appoint Richard Harrington as the Minister for Refugees. He's working across the Home Office and the Department for Local Communities, which seems to be quite a sensible move. It's one way of sort of circumnavigating the Home Office a bit, but it's also an acknowledgement that resettling refugees is a matter for communities as much as it is a matter for the Home Office. Where they're going to live, what they're going to do when they get here, etc., should all be taken into account. And Richard Harrington is seen as a safe pair of hands. He was the Minister for Refugees with the Syrian crisis, and he was sort of widely believed to have done a pretty good job there. So that seems to be a sort of good, positive step forward, and the sort of thing that Mutaz is talking about, that ways to kind of get around the Home Office rather than working with it. Again, it's probably not great news for Priti Patel. It looks a little bit like she can't deal with what's happening, but an acknowledgement that the Home Office is too big and unwieldy to sort of deal with a crisis like this nimbly and ably is probably the right thing to do. But, is it going to be enough? Probably not.
Maybe we should end on something a little different. We all saw Volodymyr Zelensky's address to the House of Commons and the Lords yesterday via video link. What were your impressions of that? How did it go down? Olivia?
Well, it was obviously a very powerful speech. It was a slightly awkward format. There was someone translating over the top of it as it was happening, and it was coming through MPs' audio kits. But it was a very powerful moment, obviously. It was the first time this has ever happened before. And it really sort of underlined for me Zelensky's charisma. He was considered a bit of a joke figure when he stepped into the presidential role. Never forget that he came up in politics through the most unusual route. He was an actor, comic actor, who then got given the role of president, which was the exact role that he had played. And people thought that he was going to be a bit out of his depth. But actually, having that sort of charisma, the way that he relates with people on a very kind of visceral level, is exactly what this crisis needs. And I thought he did it again yesterday, echoing the words of Churchill. He really, got under the skin of those Tory MPs, and that made the pleas that he was making resonate far more. So yeah, I thought it was a really interesting and powerful moment for British politics.
I agree. Although he missed my favourite line out of that speech, which is, "We shall never surrender." He didn't say that, and he should have. But I thought it was very sad. The House of Commons looked totally helpless. Here was the president of a European democracy speaking about, this is the battle for Ukraine. This is to be or not to be, and Ukraine has decided it is to be. And our response was 600 MPs stood up and clapped. I thought it was quite sad, but no, it was a powerful moment.
Tony Diver, our Whitehall correspondent, would you like the final word?
My God, the pressure of having the final word. I will boringly just emulate what Olivia and Mutaz have said on this one. I think it really demonstrated what an absolute class act Zelensky is. This is a man who is literally out on the front line a lot of the time, who is directing his country through an existential war. And what he did was deliver a highly personalised speech to MPs, tapping into exactly those emotions and those cultural references that he knew would resonate. And he came away from it, I think, with the full support of the House. And I think that was quite important.
To stay on top of all of our Ukraine coverage, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first month free at telegraph.co.uk/audio, or have it delivered straight to your inbox when you sign up to Dispatches, our daily Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from the front line from our award-winning foreign correspondents. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter to see what we're up to. If you found this show useful, follow Ukraine the Latest on your podcast app. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Theodora Ludludis and Louisa Wells, and on Twitter, Sophie Coe.